Let's speak to our correspondent, Ran Gazdiev, who's also been across this story. It has just broken, and I'm very curious just to get the minutiae of this, because it sounds very significant. Porton Down saying that they can't be certain, they can't prove that this was a Russian chemical, military-grade chemical. I mean, maybe they're still sticking to highly likely. Exactly where do we stand in terms of certainty?
Well, I was talking to chemists working for the Russian Ministry of Defense a few days ago, and while they agreed that, you know, Novichok, for example, any substance as complex as the Novichok group of viral agents, nerve agents, sorry, they cannot be made in a basement. It requires years of experience, it requires a professional laboratory, it requires dedication and money to make a nerve agent, any sort of nerve agent more complicated than VX. The Novichok group, which is 60-odd different nerve agents, they would require a laboratory, a proper laboratory to make. But with regards to identifying the origin of this substance, well, they've all but said that they believe this is Novichok. Boris Johnson, you know, if we remember, on the 4th of March when Sergei Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with this substance, 2 days later you had Boris Johnson in Parliament promising to retaliate against Russia if there was any proof at all.
Yeah, he said that Putin's smug response showed Russia's guilt.
Well, exactly. And this was a huge campaign that lasted for weeks and culminated in the expulsion of 200-odd diplomats, 100-odd Russian diplomats and 100 diplomats from the countries that expelled Russian diplomats. So Russia kicked out tit for tat, one diplomat for every one of its own that was expelled from any odd country. But Russia blamed Britain for this. They said there was no evidence, there was no proof, no discussion. It was just a few days after the incident that, in all likelihood, Russia did this. And in fact, in the media, we had this huge, from the early days, from when we found out that Sergei Skripal was the victim, that he was an MI6 double agent who was also formerly a Russian agent. From the moment we found out who he was, there was an endless, ceaseless tirade of accusations against Russia.
The government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal.
So how likely is it the 2018 election is going to be compromised by Russia?
It's highly likely that they will be doing something. We just don't know how much and when, where.
In the high-confidence assessment that was released this past October, the intelligence community made very clear that this was activity directed by the highest levels of the Russian government.
What Russia is doing when it comes to cyber warfare, not only their interference now proven in the American presidential campaign, probably in our own referendum last year, we don't have the evidence for that.
The conclusion that the Russian state was probably involved in the murder of Mr. Litvinenko is deeply disturbing.
And just to kind of back up what our correspondent Anastasia Churkin was saying in London, even just today, the UK press have been having a real field day. I mean, this is real great fodder for the tabloids in terms of their theories of how Russia was involved and, you know, how the many tentacles had wrapped itself around this story. If Porton Down comes out and says, we can't prove that it was Russia, even if they believe it was Russia, it means that it's just as likely to have been the UK or anyone else. I mean, surely the whole argument from a legal point just falls apart, doesn't it?
Well, the thing with Novichok is that, as I said, it is not a single nerve agent. It is the name of a subgroup of nerve agents. And it wasn't only Russia that was researching these. For example, back in the 90s, half a dozen of former chemists who were working on Novichok was claimed that they were working on Novichok. They emigrated from Russia. They left with the formulas that they knew, with various texts, with various information, and they, by all appearances, they settled in different countries, and they could well have shared the Novichok formula or some of the substances in the Novichok group. But the interesting thing here is that the Russian chemists who I spoke to, military chemists, they said that almost every country with significant, about 24 countries with, significant advanced chemical labs, they research and they synthesize these nerve agents. If nothing else, then to be able to make an antidote to protect themselves, or in some cases they may weaponize them. The thing with the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, is there are no inspections. So every member merely declares what they have, declares what they're going to destroy, and after that, there are no inspections. So all of these laboratories across the world, in the United States, in Russia, the United States, by the way, has still not destroyed its chemical arsenal. It says it'll do so by 2023.
It's all based on trust.
It's all based on trust, but there is also a clause that says you can research and you can synthesize nerve agents so long as it isn't to weaponize them, so long as you're doing them for research.
More trust.
Exactly. But the thing with Novichok is that many countries were working on this nerve agent, synthesizing it. We have various publications where the formula for various Novichok nerve agents have been published. We have Iranians, Americans, British, Czechoslovakians, many others who have researched and who have synthesized this nerve agent. But the thing is, to be able to, because they said that this was Novichok in the early days.
On day one.
Almost on day one. A few days later, I believe they mentioned Novichok specifically. The thing is, to be able to identify a substance is you take this substance, you measure it in a special machine, which looks at its molecular formula, and there's a vast library. It's publicly accessible. Most countries share these libraries. There's a vast library of information about these chemicals. So you put a chemical in it, it'll break it down, and if it's in this list, then it'll tell you exactly what it is. By the looks of it, the British already knew what Novichok, the nerve agent, or one of the nerve agents in the Novichok subgroup, was. They had the information about it. To get that information, though, you have first have to have synthesized the nerve agent. So you have to have produced it to be able to tell what it is. And this is the thing that these Russian chemists I was talking to say gave Britain away. They couldn't have identified the substance that quickly without having had it themselves. So you know, there's a lot of ways to look at this.
Some very interesting context. Appreciate the analysis there. Maran Gazdiev with me in the studio. Let's bring in a guest now. Let's get some more opinion on this. Journalist, broadcaster Neil Clark joins me. So, I mean, this information's just come in, this reported statement from a lab representative that was unable, Neil, to identify the origin of the Novichok agent. At this point, though, I don't know what the subsequent government response will be. I presume, though, they will say, well, even if we can't prove it, it's still highly likely. So does that actually lessen Russian culpability or not?
I think it does. I think what we've had in the past 3 weeks really is a hysterical witch hunt. We've had a trial by media, basically. The political and media establishment have actually blamed this on Russia. It's gone from it could be Russia to it's highly likely to Russia to of course it was Russia. And that's been the line taken by newspaper journalists, writers, etc., commentators on the BBC, editorials of newspapers, and it's not true. This is fake news because it certainly is not proven that it came from Russia. As you said today, you've got the Porton Down scientists saying that they cannot prove that this substance, if indeed it was Novichok, came from Russia. The original wording, of course, in Theresa May's parliamentary statement 3 weeks ago was it was of a nerve agent of a type developed by Russia, which is very, very different from saying it actually came from Russia. And as you've just said there in your report, several countries are able to make this stuff. And so it could be any number of countries who actually was responsible for this, or even a non-state actor. So I think it's quite interesting, really, what we've got. We've got the scientists, on the one hand, who are saying, look, we can't say this was from Russia, we can't prove this was from Russia. And yet we've got the neocon political establishment and the journalists in the neocon newspapers like the Times newspaper, etc., who are translating this into, of course, it was Russia. And I think we're going to have to see quite a few apologies from people now, because what's happened has been quite appalling. As a journalist, I'm absolutely ashamed, Neil, of the way the standards have slipped in my country, in my profession, and by people reporting as 100% fact things which are merely suppositions.
I mean, the fact that Porton Down, the government can't prove it was Russia, doesn't mean it wasn't Russia. It also doesn't mean that it wasn't some other country. And surely the fact that if nobody can prove anything, surely that's not enough to go forward with any kind of sanctions or expulsions of diplomats. Will the government be under pressure to walk this back, or do you think there's enough kind of momentum behind them at this stage to keep on?
Well, I think the opposition now should be holding the government to account. Just think back to 3 weeks ago when it was Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, who actually said, you know, where's the evidence? I want to see the evidence if I can. And he said that he asked whether Russia had been given a sample, and he was hounded. He was absolutely attacked by the neocon attack dogs, the feral attack dogs in the media, for being a traitor, even for questioning, for saying, look, can we see some evidence? And then he sort of backtracked a little bit, and he actually supported expelling Russian diplomats, which was wrong, because if you cannot prove something, how can you then go out there and punish Russia? Whatever happened to the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof? So I think that really what we've seen in the last 3 weeks in Britain has been really quite alarming, really, on a number of levels. The way that the government has accused Russia of doing something for which they didn't have the proof. We've had a real escalation of the diplomatic tensions between Russia and Britain. We've seen expulsions. We've seen Britain not only expelling Russian diplomats, Neil, but they've been trying to pressurise other European countries to expel Russian diplomats too. And they haven't got the proof, which is what I've said all along. So I think what should happen now is the opposition should call for an emergency debate on this in Parliament. And I think there should be calls for the resignation of the British Prime Minister Theresa May and the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. I think this is very important now.
Well, you mentioned Boris Johnson because, you know, some people have kind of gone all in, as I've tended to say, on this Skripal case. And Boris Johnson went so far as to say it was overwhelmingly likely that Vladimir Putin ordered the nerve agent attack here. So they've kind of really put all of their eggs in this one basket. You can't realistically see someone like Boris Johnson backing down on this. Is this suddenly become like a very public battle to the end in terms of political careers?
Absolutely. I think Boris Johnson is an absolute disgrace to Britain. And as you say, he's gone so far down this line now of accusing Russia that it's going to be very, very difficult for him to come out now and say, oops, I'm sorry, I went ahead of myself. We actually haven't got any proof. Because then, of course, he would have to resign, and the government too. So I think it's very important now what happens. I think the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, was right at the very start to be sceptical about this and to ask for evidence. He then, unfortunately, allowed himself to be bullied, to go on the back foot, and then to kind of take a more anti-Russian line, which was wrong when we hadn't had the evidence. So I think Jeremy Corbyn now has got a great opportunity, and Labour, to make capital out of this and to say that what's happened is the government have presented something as a matter of fact, which wasn't fact. And we really went back to the Iraqi WMD story again, didn't we? And as you said, it's no proof that it isn't Russia, but there's no proof that it is Russia. And of course, we also got to look at motive, very important in this. Motive does come into it. Who had the motive to commit this attack? Russia. President Putin, had he wanted to kill Sergei Skripal, had plenty of time to do so when Skripal was in a Russian jail. Why on earth would he want to do this just before, or 3 months before the World Cup in Russia, and when Bill Browder, the very anti-Russian figure, was going to address the House of Commons, the MPs, calling for tougher sanctions just 2 days later? Why on earth would he want to do it at this particular time? I think the timing is very, very important. And I think what we now need is to hold the government to account for what they've done, and the media too. The media played an absolutely crucial role in all of this. I've lost track of the number of articles I've read in the last 3 weeks in the British press saying, you know, evil Putin, he's trying to poison people on the streets of Britain, how appalling it is, we should take the World Cup away from Russia, we should do this and that. So I think a lot of people now have got egg on their face, and I think it's up now for Jeremy Corbyn and the opposition to hold the government properly to account. And in fact, we ought to be holding the journalists to account too, who have propagated this fake news, really.
And just finally, before we let you go and get an update from our correspondent, Neil, I'm just reading the stories as it's breaking now. And it was the head of Porton Down, the Britain's military research centre there. He actually refused to comment on whether the lab itself had produced or maintained stocks of this nerve agent. I mean, you can't read too much into that, but it's a strange one, isn't it? We'd clarify a lot if the chief of Porton Down just came out and said, look, we've never synthesised this chemical. It answers a lot of questions.
It's absolutely obvious, isn't it? You don't have to be Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot to realise that for Porton Down to identify this, Neil, as Novichok, they would have to have some substances, some examples of Novichok themselves. So in other words, how on earth, without that, would they know it was Novichok? So and I think the refusal to answer that question is quite revealing. Clearly, that Porton Down probably, it did have Novichok. That's why they identified it as Novichok, and that raises other questions, such as could possibly some stock have got missing? Could there have been some smuggling going on? Could Sergei Skripal have been involved directly or indirectly with this? And of course, Porton Down, as we know, is about 7 miles down the road from where the poisoning took place. So I think it is highly significant, surely, that you've got the government chemical weapons laboratory literally down the road from where this incident took place. So there's a lot of questions here to be asked, Neil. There's really a lot of scenarios that are possible, and we need to be discussing them openly and not be shouted down by people who are screaming that we're traitors or we're not patriotic simply for questioning, but for wanting evidence. And that's been the problem with the media and the political class in the last 3 weeks in Britain. It's been quite hysterical. It's been a witch hunt. And I think now that Porton Down have come out and said we can't prove this was Russia, hopefully now we're going to get people going to actually, if not apologise, but actually to get a bit more sanity involved in this debate.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I should say that the head of Porton Down has said that there's no way, is the quote, that this could have come from us or left the 4 walls of our facility, but then wouldn't comment on whether they'd actually synthesised the nerve agent themselves. OK, we'll wrap things up there. Appreciate your time. Journalist, broadcaster Neil Clark is